Good day and welcome back to the Ask Pastor Law podcast. This week we continue what we started almost a month ago when we released a video suggesting that parents are out of touch with tech, culture, trends, etc. And I opened up a challenge and I said that I don't necessarily believe that to be true. And at the time, I know I came to that conclusion because I was certainly not out of touch. And I still didn't believe that it was as wholesale as many made it to be. And so I opened up a challenge to the community that anyone who feels they have something to contribute to this narrative, they should DM me and we'll engage online interview or podcast style. And no one but my son, my eldest son, took me up on that challenge. And we were able to discuss about 3 weeks ago a few things, and it resonated with the community. But the challenge remained open. And if I remember the parameters for the challenge and the non-negotiable was that you be a believer. And that was not something that I was going to trade off. And so I looked around, the challenge was still open, and I found someone else. Someone who I know you would definitely benefit from. And again, selfishly, it's still in the bloodline. He's my nephew, Zachary. Please invite him, or welcome him, I should say, to the broadcast this evening. Zachary, can you hear me?
I can hear you, Pastor Law. Thank you for having me.
Okay, good stuff. Okay, so you heard that intro. You know exactly what I'm looking to do. I know that many have suggested that there's a generation gap, there are cultural differences. There's so many negatives that put the parent in the out of touch camp. That yes, we're out of touch because we refuse to change with time. And I know that's a discussion that I would expect an adult to, come and present to me, but they're not coming. So at the moment, I'm having the younger folk, come and dwell on this narrative. And you were so excited about the opportunity, and not just because uncle asked or uncle said. You wanted to contribute, and I'm so excited that you're here. So please let the community know who you are, a brief story, so that they will understand exactly what you bring to the table. Okay.
My name is Zachary, Zach. I'm 21 years old, just graduated, about to do my master's. Like many, had my personal journey with technology, with the culture, um, struggles, successes, failures. But through it all, God has kept me. He's guided me through my parents. Um, and I share a unique insight just because you try to understand both sides. You try to understand where you're coming from, but also where the other person, specifically my parents, are coming from. Um, and I'm very happy that I'm able to testify um, that my parents have successfully and very well um, have guided me and been patient with me. And it's very much been a collaborative effort, but I thank God for my parents consistently. Um, and hopefully, I'm able to share some of my thoughts articulately and or coherently, sorry, and articulate myself well.
Well, I have no doubts that that's exactly what you're going to do, and I know your story. Needless to say, you're my nephew, so I know your story, and I was excited when I knew you were going to come on the broadcast because you say it as it is, and you don't dress it up. You're just going to be candid. Uh, it's important that the community know that you are not coerced at all to do this. This is just you wanting to make a difference to the family cyber clinic community, and that's important to me. Really important that many will learn from this. So, right out of the bat, I would want to know where you stand. I know you've already alluded to your parents being, central to your upbringing in that sense. They've been quite hands-on. But based on that exposure and the exposure you've seen other kids in your age range or group or demographic even, what would you say to this narrative? Are we out of touch, or are we in vogue? Are we in touch as parents regarding those three areas? And if you want to extend it, please feel free to do so.
I think it's a nuanced answer, and it's hard for me to just say yes or no to whether parents are out or in touch with the generation of today or the young people of today. I think first and foremost, it's a bit harsh um, to to judge or assess parents in that way, just because that generational gap has always existed from generation to generation. So the difference in generation between my parents and me is very similar to the difference in generation between my parents and my grandparents. In fact, if you're anything like me, it's actually a two-generation gap between me and my parents, because in between me and my parents, there's the millennials, whereas I'm considered to be Gen Z. I think the other thing you also have to factor into it is that we're growing up in a different. Um, Obviously, we're talking about time, but we also grow up in a different place. So the societal norms are very much different from where my parents grew up and where I have grown up. Me and my younger sister, in fact. I think when it comes to time, though, and whether parents are in touch with the times of today, I think the principles are still the same, but I think it manifests itself differently. And an analogy I'd use to describe or to sort of explain that is that when you have a computer, and I guess it's only right to use a tech example, but when you have like a computer or an application, and perhaps you use one model, use one version, and then perhaps you don't use that version for a while, you don't keep up to date with the different versions that are coming out, the subsequent versions that are coming out. If you then come back to that product or to that company, let's say 5 years, 10 years down the line, you probably know your basic way around the application or around the device, but there'll be certain aspects that you won't be as in tune with. There'll be
But
certain aspects
that
that
I purposely want to interrupt you there so that our community would will appreciate the engagement. Usually they'll say, "Why you're not asking this question? Why you're not asking that question?" But that can happen. The thing you're mentioning now can happen to an adult or a child. You know,
mm,
I mean, you've got to be intentional. And that's why I disagree, not with you, but I disagree with that notion that we are out of touch because yes, we've mentioned generational gaps and all that, or barriers, language barriers, and all that. But something as important and as deliberate as updating um, software on your laptop, I
mm,
think it's just common sense. And I know a
yeah,
few of my friends who are savvy enough to make sure that they're updating. So I don't necessarily believe that um, an older guy or older lady would miss will miss that opportunity to upgrade or stay up to date. I think that can happen to anyone.
mm.
So I hear you, but I'm hoping that you can highlight the things that are obviously lacking, in our own portfolio as parents that will label us as being out of touch. I don't know
Well, I
whether
think,
you see where I'm going. Yeah.
yeah, first and foremost, like when you and one of the a word you used, which I think was very profound, was intentional. I think as the platform encourages and promotes, parents need to be intentional as they invest in learning and knowing about specifically technology, but also the culture that their young ones are growing up in today. The issue is, and I think this is perhaps where some of the young ones feel that parents are out of touch, is that that attempt is not always made. And the reason why I say that attempt is not always made is because, like I said earlier, the principles are still the same. Now, if you use sort of the computer analogy, if the current computer that I'm using now is working fine, I'm not inclined to get a new one, because that process of getting a new one or updating the software, so to speak, takes time. It can sometimes come with, um, if we're using the software example, bugs. It can sometimes not be tried and tested. So sometimes you're getting a beta version, not always. Sometimes you get a version that has been tested and everything has been made sure to be working properly. But sometimes the beta version is available for update. Now, I think sometimes where parents, and having conversations with my parents, I think sometimes where parents sometimes refuse to update is because of the fact that in their minds, the the principle is still the same. The lesson still needs to be taught. The correction still needs to happen. And in a way, I agree. I was having a conversation with someone recently, and we're talking about the Bible, and we're talking about how the same Bible is used for the poor man and for the rich man. The same Bible is used for the black and the white, so to speak. The same Bible is used for adult and child. And by that, the point I was trying to make was that God's word and God's principles and these statutes apply to everyone, regardless of time, regardless of location. And I think rightfully so, parents sort of take that same mindset. What was considered right back then should be considered right today. What was considered wrong back then should be considered wrong today. That those things haven't changed. However, what I would say is that the way wrong manifests itself, the pressures of perhaps not acting wrong in today's world are, I wouldn't say more profound, but they affect the human mind and humans differently. I think when it comes to, for example, cancel culture, if there are certain things that you don't say, if there are certain things that you don't say correctly, the damage is not necessarily worse, but it's still very much present. And I think sometimes parents can be um, slightly, what's the right word to use here? You see, again, that's sort of the new age mindset. What's the right word to use? Um, but I think sometimes parents can refuse to acknowledge some things until perhaps there's uh, an evident or clear need to do so. On the flip side, though, what I would say um, in favor of the parents is that, again, those principles are the same and they're still very much needed. The ability to stand on your feet and to know the difference between right and wrong is still very much needed. And sometimes it is necessary to go back to how it used to be, or to learn perhaps the manual way before you then switch to automatic. It's like with driving, to use that example. Cars today are becoming very much, or most of cars today that are being made today are automatic, but learning manual is still a valuable skill. And that doesn't, it might take more time. It might seem tedious because you're thinking that the work is not needed. But at the same time, the principle of the skill is still the same. And sometimes learning that in a way that can be considered outdated can still be valuable to you.
I and I agree. I don't know. You didn't see me when I was doing when you were saying something in favor of the parents. But I wrote something down, and I think I shared it, perhaps with Edward, or maybe in the first video that I gave. And I mentioned that there was a technological divide. The fact that parents are not as familiar with tech as the younger ones, yourselves, are. Many just make that assumption that because we're not as exposed, that there is there's a negative. and I know that that can be the case, you know. But I'm still I didn't bring you here to um, you know, convince me or make a case for parents necessarily.
Mm,
um, I wanted you to be candid, and that's exactly what you're being. You're
mm,
being candid, and so far I'm hearing you. Um, you know, I'm hearing you make a case for both camps, which every respectful son will do. You know, so I'm now going to twist your leg a bit. You know, and that's not to expose mom and dad or expose the adults around you. That's not my
yeah.
intention. But I I'm looking because I want the community to hear. In fact, I love the fact that you are being, you know, you're presenting it the way, because I I said be truthful, and yes, I expect no less. So this
Mm,
is your experience. So perhaps I should now ask questions based on what you perhaps think parents can do, should do, if they feel out of touch, and what you bring to the table. Because we've mentioned generation gaps, we've mentioned language barriers, mentioned those things, and I keep repeating them.
mm,
If let's just assume that parents are out of touch,
mhm,
what can you do as a younger one, or what have you done as the younger one to bridge the gap?
mm,
Because I know that those things that I've mentioned, the, you know, religious beliefs and all that, could mean that we're not as parents as exposed to pop culture, because
mm.
we believe it's aggressive, we believe that it's too in your face, and there's an agenda. Needless to say, there is an agenda. But I want to know, and I'm sure the community want to know, what you feel. Let's assume that it is right, that, or correct, that parents are out of touch. What can you do to bridge that gap, to make all those things, the negative things, go away, so that we can walk together?
Well, I think in our house, the biggest thing has been communication. I think, like you said, with my parents' generation, they came into a world without, I mean, not say without technology, but uh, things like Google didn't exist when my parents were my age. Those things have come into the world and become commonplace as I've grown up. And so, whilst I was learning perhaps how to type on a keyboard from maybe age 9, 10, or even younger than that, really, my parents probably wasn't learning, weren't, my parents weren't learning that skill from like a digital keyboard until maybe 25, 26, 27. So there has to be that kind of understanding from both parties. Like today, even today, for example, I'll see my parents use their phones, and it dawns on me that these, like, my parents didn't grow up with these things. My mum got her first phone when she was 26. So I can't expect them to understand or immediately understand where I'm coming from and my vantage point. Now, the example I always use when, for me, perspective, I think, is a really big thing. And the reason why I say that is because everyone has a different perspective. Even if you grow up under the same roof, you see things differently. And the reason why communication is so important is because if I point like this, for example, you on the other side of the camera don't know what I'm pointing towards. And the reason why is you're not looking at the screen, or you're not looking from the same place that I'm looking at. So you might think I'm pointing towards you, but I might be pointing towards something behind the camera. And it's that communication that is necessary that allows you to see it the way I'm seeing it. And similarly, when it comes to technology, people will have, regardless of generational gaps, regardless of beliefs, regardless of anything, you'll always have slightly different perspectives on how perhaps social media should be used, how perhaps you should tackle certain issues in society. Now, the key, and where I think parents and young ones can work together, is having that communication to establish this is what we've been taught perhaps in school. This is perhaps what we're hearing from our peers. This is what we're perhaps inclined naturally to think or naturally to do in these kind of situations. You clearly think otherwise. Now, you understanding where I'm coming from guide me as a parent how I should tackle the situation. I think perhaps sometimes where there's perhaps a breakdown is where parents are saying, you need to turn right, turn left, and then go straight. But the young ones are thinking, to even get to that road to go straight, I need to take 2 rights and then a left. And so for that reason, it becomes difficult because you're not starting from the same place. Now you're trying to get your ultimately, I think most parents and children are trying to get to the same destination. It's just a matter of which path you choose to take. And the hope is, I think for most parents, that they'll be walking in the same path with their child. They'll be walking aligned with their child rather than dragging the child along one path or the child walks on their own path by themselves. Because you can drag a child as much as you want. When that child reaches a certain age, either when they're legally able to be on their own or even before that, that child will stand up and walk away from you. And where you want to guide the child, but you don't want to lose the child. And I think where that's possible is when you're communicating. Um, I think there's something else you touched on. I think you spoke about um, perhaps how young ones feel. Speaking to people like my age and sort of speaking to perhaps people that share the same sentiment as me, but also people that disagree with me. I think one of the sort of talking points has been parents. It's never been parents don't know. It's always been parents don't understand. And I think it's that lack of understanding that comes sometimes stems from a lack of communication, but sometimes stems from a there's nothing new under the sun. We've seen it all kind of mindset. And in all honesty, that's not always the case. Um, the things that are considered wrong today, yes, they were considered wrong back then, but they're celebrated now. Whereas perhaps before they used to be hidden or they used to be considered a taboo. So that communication is definitely needed, especially when children are being exposed at such a young age in today's world. That communication is vital.
Okay, so I hear you on communication, and yeah, very good breakdown there. Now, one thing that I have observed, and I think it's still rife even as I speak, is that as parents, especially African parents, we have certain media consumption habits, you know, and
Yeah.
I'm going to break that down. Typically, you will have a parent prefer watching TV. So if they want to consume news, they'll rather do it on the traditional television, okay?
Mm,
And you have other traditional media sources like radio,
mm,
newspaper. In fact, just mentioning newspaper makes me sound very old, you know. What I know that when we were a lot younger, adult still, but a lot younger, we used to most of the information, and this is not so far back. We're talking maybe 10 years max. We still used to look forward to, especially when I used to commute by train, Evening Standard or Metro. These were papers that if you wanted to know what was trending, even though it was 24 hours before, if you wanted to
mm,
know what was trending, you looked forward to taking those, getting those papers.
mm,
Nice. Metro used to be more out of date than Evening Standard because the Evening Standard will bring news from about 12ish that day. So on your trip back home at 5 p.m., you have a newspaper that you can use. You
mm,
know, the tube is not as high tech as it is now. You probably have Wi-Fi in tubes or whatever now. Then you didn't have that. You couldn't have any of those things
mm,
in the on the tube network. So you needed that information. So you to keep yourself informed. The Evening Standard, a very traditional consuming source, was very useful to us.
mm,
Now we could be labeled as being, we use the word at the beginning, a cake, for preferring that form of media. But it is media. Newspapers, magazines, they're still something. You know, and when you think about it, reading a newspaper or reading a magazine, compare that with reading the same information on a phone.
Mm,
Okay, the distractions you can get from the text messages that are coming in from Instagram, Facebook Messenger, WhatsApp, you don't have that problem when you're holding onto a newspaper or when you're watching a television set. So
mm,
there are reasons why you have parents, and I'm making a case now for parents not being out of touch, or even if they are, there's a reason why it will appear so. They're so used to those media consumption habits, or they have those habits, which makes it appear to the uninformed that we're sticking to old school. You
mm,
know, if new school being the internet and all that it's connected to, if that could be moderated in some form, or well, the vendors try everything. They have focus mode, they have do not disturb, so that
mm,
there are features on those phones that will help take away that noise. But I'm saying that there's some people who don't want to bother with learning those things when they can still just go to a newspaper. The Sun,
mm,
Mirror, Evening Standard, they're still selling newspapers.
yeah.
So there is a niche that still prefer traditional media, and they can't be seen to be out of touch, or one shouldn't conclude that they're out of touch. It's just a preference. And I also would want, and I'll soon allow you speak. There's this other thing that I know would cause a parent to stick to their, old ways, prioritizing family and work. For example, they may choose to just prioritize family, work, and not do social media. That
Mm,
doesn't mean that they're out of touch. It's just a choice. And the choices that most parents are making or have made, when you dig deep, they've made it as a sacrifice for the benefit of the home.
mm.
Because if they get as engaged as you young folk are, you guys will be going, there will be no direction really, because I'm entertained. I'm as, not addicted, but I'm as connected to the internet as you are. If two of us are, that means we could be in the same room and
And
not communicate. And you mentioned communication. So making a case for parents and old folk like myself, there may be reasons, underlying reasons why we refuse to be too open to pop
mm.
culture or the trends of the day. How do you speak to that, or is there anything I've missed out?
I mean, as the phrase goes, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So I kind of understand. My dad's similar, for example, to this day. If he walks past the train station and they have newspapers, he will still collect one, even though he has several news apps on his phone. Um, I remember growing up, I've always been a big music listener, and when I was younger, music was traditionally consumed through radio in the car, or CDs, or going back slightly more, or slightly further rather, cassette tapes in the stereo. Now, as I grew older, we started having iPods, we started having phones, we had earphones. So the music I was consuming was very much personal. I was walking around the house with my earphones in. I have a wired, wireless. Now, for a long time, my mum couldn't understand it. She was saying, "Why are you always walking around with earphones in your ear? Take the earphones out. You're blocking the entire world out. This is wrong. If you want to listen to music, play it out loud for everyone to hear, all of this." Now, um, in some sense, she was definitely right. Listening to so much music, and even listening to it at higher volume, can very much damage your eardrums. That's a scientific fact. But I think also where she was right was, um, too much of anything can be a negative. And the way I was doing it was very much on an excessive level. Perhaps what I'd say she perhaps didn't understand the reasoning behind it was music is consumed differently in our generation with things like streaming, with things like uh, Apple Music, Spotify, and all these sort of platforms. Music is being consumed at such a fast rate in today's world. I remember we spoke recently. We were talking about the oversupply of music, and there are so SoundCloud music, YouTube Music, Amazon Music, and if you want some like other ones, you have Deezer, Last FM, Tidal, all kinds of platforms. And so, rather than listening to the radio where my parents still sort of listen to their music, I'm hearing music on social media, in Instagram videos. I'm hearing music in YouTube videos. I'm hearing music on streaming platforms. So we're consuming music at a much larger rate. Um, and so I think there's definitely differences, but like you said, it's not always a problem. It's not always a negative thing. I think there just has to be an awareness of the fact that there are those differences. But again, those principles of do everything in moderation, those principles of try not to always be secluded, those are still principles that are still relevant to today. Um, it's just about having that awareness to translate it and not come across as if, or not completely reject the notion of whatever is taking place today. You can still be in love with, like, for example, me personally, I'm not really big on social media. That sometimes, well, it oftentimes means I'm out of the loop. So I hear things last amongst all my friends. In fact, if anything, it's become a running joke amongst my friends, amongst people in my house, that if you want Zachary to know something, tell him in person and tell him twice. Otherwise, he's not going to know, he's not going to remember, he's not going to have any clue about what's going on. Um, and I like it that way. I prefer it that way. I prefer not having to know everything. At the same time, I'm also aware that some other people are not inclined in the same, are not designed the same way. And so it's just being aware that there are those differences and being able to communicate across those boundaries and still sort of be able um, to connect, if that makes sense.
It does. It does. It does. And I'm glad that and we're sort of bringing this to a close now, but I'm glad that we've been able to have a chat. I can hear the community members. Some of them, most of them actually, will align with how you are thinking. Certainly, because the non-negotiable is that you're a believer, and as a child who's been brought up, in faith, there's so many things that we would not do that others who are not in faith or of the faith will do. So, because there's a respect culture, and thank God for that, that's a useful, in fact, it's an asset in our day. Because of that asset that that demographic, being brought up in a Christian home, that just that niche brings something to the table, which would mean that you'll be more forgiving to a dad or a mom who is not quite in touch with things. And like I've kind of established, there's several reasons why you have parents who don't want to necessarily be that exposed to trends, cultural norms, because they may battle or they may walk against the faith or the belief systems that we have in place as believers. So I suppose that's why I'm robust about the fact that we're not really out of touch. Perhaps we've made the right choice to stay aligned with what's expected of us, would mean that we do not necessarily entangle ourselves with so much pop culture. We don't get distracted by trends, because by design, they're supposed to take you, they're designed to take you somewhere where
Mm,
we may not really want to go. So we bring
mm,
up these, we see the red flags from far, and we
yeah.
choose to stay in that safe zone,
Mm,
which many will confuse as, being outmodish, being out of touch, a cake, that word again. So I see, I can identify with a lot of things you're saying because it's the way I've also raised, where we've raised our own, your cousins. So it's yeah, I can't see that I can milk you any further than I have already because oh, you want to say something? Yeah, please
I
do.
think the thing is that I think you referenced it just there briefly, that sometimes parents think what worked for me and or what worked for them, and they turned out right, is often a phrase I hear. It worked for us and we turned out right, so it should work for you.
Yeah.
I think that's sometimes where the disconnect happens because children then feel, but you didn't grow up in a world where all your friends were on social media. You didn't grow up in a world where your teachers are constantly telling you one thing whilst your parents are telling you the opposite. You didn't grow up in a world where um, if I share my beliefs as a Christian in school, I can very easily be told off. Or if I disagree with something because it goes against my beliefs in school, or for the young ones that are now working, I can very easily be told off or lose my job or lose my place. So I think that's sometimes where that sort of disconnect happens. I think also, again, and it slightly ties into communication, but a big sort of topic in the culture today is modesty. And I know that there seems to be a disconnect between sometimes parents or the generation above us and our generation. And sometimes that disconnect is what is considered modest. Now, from an objective standpoint, I think most people can sort of tell the difference. Like, what would you say is considered modest and what could you say is considered immodest, if I think that's the right word, immodest. Um, but I think so where the conversation and debate lies is what's considered normal in today's standards and what's considered excessive or extreme in today's standards versus the standards of old. Things like boys wearing earrings, um, thi- things like whether it be girls wearing crop tops or clothes are a bit too tight. The question then becomes, because some of these things aren't specifically addressed. Like the specific clothes that you wear isn't always written in black and white ink, depending on what version you're reading of the Bible. In the Bible, and I know speaking to some youth, there are some things that they read that they say, "Okay, I can see this is in the Bible," but there are some things that perhaps isn't explicitly written. You should not wear this item of clothing. And I think sometimes speaking to the youth of today, sometimes they say, how much of it is biblical and how much of it is the customs or the traditions of our parents. And like I said, I think that's where that communication has to be important because it has to be this is what was considered um, bad or excessive in our time. And we're aware that perhaps across most stores or across most shops or in this specific culture, this is considered normal, or this is how they're making the clothes today, or this is what's on sale. But at the same time, you have to be aware of one, the image that you're putting out there, because you don't only represent yourself, you represent if you're a child of God, you're representing the family of God. As a believer, I know we don't speak for each other, but we are representative of the Christian values. When we tell people we're a Christian, suddenly the way you speak, the way you act, the way you dress, all are judged as a reflection of Christian values. And so, lest you now cause someone else to think that this is what is right,
Exactly. Yeah.
you see, it then becomes it becomes much bigger than us.
Mhm.
And that's why I say that communication is so important because it's fine if you have differing views. It's fine if the culture is different from what your parents are saying. But as a young person who most young people are not looking to rebel against their parents. Most young people are not looking to go a different way. They just want to understand for themselves so that when they're on their own, they can stand on their own 2 feet.
Yeah.
It gets to a certain age where, oh, I'm here because mom and dad say so, or I do this because mom and dad say so, or um, I'm not going to go to this place because mom and dad say so. It gets to a certain age where that's not going to be a strong enough response because of the pressure that you're facing from the
Yeah.
world. And so that's why I say, again, communication is so important so that the child understands what to do and why he or she is doing it, but also so the parent can understand this is why the child might be tempted, or this is why um, the child may feel inclined to do so, or may feel why this is right.
I actually feel, and I totally agree. I totally agree with everything you said. And I feel that that communication that you basically that's formed the basis of your argument, that good communication, healthy communication at home is key. And I think through communicating, that healthy communication you mentioned, you don't see any gaps. You don't, it's hard for you to make a, or come to a conclusion that, you know, your dad or mom is out of touch. Because
Mm,
you know their story, you live with them.
mm,
So in my humble submission to you, all those who, well, you're not coming to that conclusion, it's evident, but those who have come to the conclusion that parents are out of touch, I think you get this big picture, you get a clearer picture when you start, touching on the little things that make the family tick, the family work, and communication, healthy communication, transparency. We speak about it a lot on the platform. These are the things that will help encourage, because I know that I did ask or mention that as young ones, you've got to make it easier for us to break some of those, stereotypes or the things that we are holding on to, that we can relax a bit. Mom
mm,
and dad will relax a bit if they know they have a savvy son who would warn them of issues that they may encounter if they go gung ho on the internet,
mm,
things like that. So it could just be that some parents, definitely not me, some parents don't want to get too deep because it's an unknown and it's a territory, it's a region that Pastor Law has said is so dangerous. So why do I want to go to that place eagerly? So they may choose to stay back, does not mean that they're out of touch. In
mm.
fact, it's considered wisdom. you know
One
I'm so
thing,
grateful. I'm so grateful. You want to close, well, actually close with these last thoughts.
yeah,
Let's,
just
because I
just one last thing. One thing that my dad has always said since I was young is there's no manual to being a parent.
hmm,
There's no blueprint. Every child is different. Again, even if you grow up in the same house.
yeah.
And what was worked for you when you were a child was not immediately or naturally going to work for this generation.
Hmm.
But like we sort of discussed today, it's taking the time to adapt. It's like when you get an update, you get sort of a few notes. Here's what's different. Here's what's new. You take the time to read that. That transition is seamless.
Yeah.
But when we ignore those little changes and those little evolutions and the additions and even the subtractions sometimes as well,
Hmm.
that's where it can be difficult. But don't worry, parents, you'll be okay.
Yes. Oh, so Zachary, I'm so grateful that we've been able to do this longer than I was anticipating. I didn't want to take too much of your time. Your evenings are crucially important to young folk, and especially on a Monday. But I'm so grateful that you've made the time. I'm so grateful that you've you know come to share with the community, because that's all I'm after, is to get perspective so that people can learn, can grow, you know. And it's just not monotone. It's not just me telling you or telling the community what they should do. And that's why bringing people on podcast style, helps mix it up a bit, so that you can, we can all benefit from each other's, journey. So I'm so grateful. Grateful is an understatement. I'm so grateful. I'm proud of your journey. Needless to say, and I've told you this enough times, but it's nice to see the outcome or the product of all those years of directing. In fact, when you think about it, Family Cyber Clinic, we started it years before we launched it 4 years ago, because that was our life. And we felt that people will benefit, from the hand holding, the shading. And that's how the vision was birthed. And so in many ways, you are part of this journey, and you don't hide that fact. So I'm so grateful that we've been able to do this. And this is just the beginning. I know I've hinted you that watch this space, because I'll look to see how engaging this episode is, and see what we can birth from this going forward. So thank you so much for your time, and I'm honored. Many will benefit from this, I can tell you, and long may that continue. Okay?
Amen.
Good man. Don't go away. I'm just going to close out. It's important, needless to say, to note that the reasons that you've heard Zachary and I, go over, they're not unique, to a demographic, to African parents or English parents, Jamaican parents, or American parents. It's not unique at all. They apply to parents from various cultural backgrounds. The generation gap that I kept talking about and the cultural differences, they usually can create tension or misunderstanding between generations. However, it's also an opportunity, as you've seen Zach eloquently make very clear, for intergenerational dialogue and mutual understanding, as younger generations can share their perspectives and parents can provide guidance based on their own experiences and values. It's a win-win. So if you're making an argument whether we are out of touch or in touch, I think the obvious is before us. But I still want many others to come and join, this challenge, young or old. Let's inform the community. I've been your host today, Lawrence Edem. Until next week, God bless and goodbye.